Sometimes the most dangerous betrayal is the one that happens inside the walls of a family that looks perfect from the outside. On the surface, the Mercer family appeared to be everything people admired in New York society: wealth, stability, and a name associated with power in the corporate world. Jonathan Mercer, a successful real estate investor, was often featured in business magazines as a symbol of disciplined ambition. His wife, Claire Donovan, was seen as the quiet strength behind his success, a woman who managed their household with grace and devotion. And their daughter, Emily Mercer, was described by those who knew her as bright, gentle, and full of life. But behind closed doors, nothing was as flawless as it seemed. The Mercer residence, located in an upscale neighborhood overlooking the city skyline, had slowly transformed from a home filled with warmth into a space filled with silence. Claire noticed at first in small details that others might dismiss. Jonathan began coming home later than usual. Phone calls were taken behind closed doors. Conversations became shorter, colder, and increasingly transactional. At first, she told herself it was business pressure. That was easier to believe than the alternative. Meanwhile, Emily's health began to change in ways that could not be ignored. What started as occasional fatigue turned into persistent medical concerns that required ongoing care and attention. Doctors' appointments became routine, and Claire found herself navigating hospital corridors alone more often than not. Jonathan attended when it was convenient, but his presence felt distant, as if his mind were always somewhere else. One evening, Claire stood outside Emily's hospital room, watching her daughter sleep under soft medical lighting. The machines hummed quietly, marking time in a way that felt heavier than usual. A nurse passed by and offered a reassuring nod, but Claire's attention was elsewhere. She had just received another message from Jonathan saying he would be late again. No explanation beyond work obligations. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. At home, Jonathan sat in his private study reviewing financial documents, but his focus was fragmented. Across his screen were tabs unrelated to business, conversations he had not fully closed, and decisions he had not yet justified to himself. Among them was a name that appeared more frequently than it should have: Victoria Lane. She was not part of his official life, yet her presence had begun to influence the space between his priorities and his choices. Nothing explicit was ever spoken aloud within the Mercer household about distance or change. Instead, it accumulated quietly, like dust settling in rooms no one entered anymore. Claire continued to maintain order, ensuring Emily's medical needs were met, managing household responsibilities, and preserving a sense of normalcy for her daughter. But inside, she began to notice a truth forming that she could no longer fully avoid. The family she was trying to hold together was no longer moving in the same direction. One evening, after returning from the hospital, Claire placed Emily's medication on the kitchen counter and paused. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of the city outside. Jonathan had not yet returned. In that silence, she realized that waiting had slowly become her default state. Waiting for him to come home. Waiting for explanations. Waiting for things to return to what they once were. But somewhere deep inside, a quieter thought began to surface, one she had not yet spoken aloud. What if nothing was going to return at all? And in that moment, without any confrontation, argument, or visible breaking point, the foundation of everything she believed about her family began to shift in ways she could no longer ignore. The change in the Mercer household did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like a slow shift in temperature that becomes noticeable only after it has already altered the environment. For Claire Donovan, the realization became clearer in the days following her quiet moment in the kitchen. Jonathan Mercer's absence was no longer an occasional pattern. It had become a structure of behavior. He was present less often, and even when he was physically inside the home, his attention seemed divided, as if part of him remained elsewhere. Emily Mercer, still under ongoing medical care, began to sense the emotional distance as well. She did not fully understand the complexity of adult relationships, but she understood consistency, and that consistency was fading. Her questions became more frequent, though still gentle in tone. "When is Dad coming home?" she would ask, often without expecting a precise answer. Claire would respond with patience, but each time the question was repeated, it carried slightly more weight than before. Jonathan, meanwhile, continued to operate within two parallel realities. In one, he remained a respected figure in the business world, attending meetings, approving deals, and maintaining his public image as a disciplined and focused investor. In the other, he was increasingly drawn into interactions that he did not fully acknowledge within his own household narrative. Among those interactions was Victoria Lane, a presence that had become more frequent in his private communications. Their conversations were not publicly visible, but they influenced his decision-making in subtle ways, shifting priorities that once centered on family obligations. Claire first became aware that something had changed not through direct confirmation, but through absence of alignment. Scheduled family dinners were postponed. Medical appointments for Emily were rescheduled without consultation. Even simple routines, like weekend time together, began to dissolve into undefined commitments. One afternoon, Claire accompanied Emily to a specialist appointment at the hospital. The physician explained the latest results in careful, measured language, outlining the importance of emotional stability alongside medical treatment. Claire listened attentively, but her attention was partially divided by a growing internal realization. Stability was not only medical, it was also relational. That evening, Jonathan arrived home later than usual. The house was dimly lit, and the silence between rooms felt heavier than before. Claire did not immediately confront him. Instead, she observed the way he entered the space, the way he avoided prolonged eye contact, the way his presence no longer naturally settled into the environment of the home. During dinner, Emily spoke softly about her day, describing small details from her hospital visit. Jonathan responded with brief acknowledgement, but his focus drifted frequently toward his phone. Claire noticed this pattern without comment, but internally, something began to shift. It was no longer confusion. It was recognition. Later that night, after Emily had gone to rest, Claire remained in the living room alone. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. She reviewed recent weeks in her mind, not searching for a single defining moment, but for a pattern that had gradually formed without announcement. The realization was not dramatic. It was structural. Their family life had not broken in one instant. It had been slowly redefined through absence, distraction, and unspoken distance. Across the city, Jonathan sat in his private office reviewing a document that required his signature, yet his attention repeatedly drifted. On his desk, his phone displayed an unread message from Victoria Lane. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he stared at it for several seconds, as if weighing something that could not be measured in financial terms. At that same moment, Claire stood in her kitchen at home, looking at a framed family photo on the counter. It was not recent. It represented a version of their lives that still felt complete. She placed it down gently, not out of anger, but out of understanding that what it represented no longer fully matched the present reality. And in that quiet separation between memory and truth, the foundation of what once defined the Mercer family continued to shift, not through confrontation, but through the steady accumulation of emotional distance that could no longer be ignored. The distance within the Mercer family did not expand through confrontation, but through repetition of absence. Claire Donovan had begun to recognize a pattern that no longer required confirmation. Each day followed a similar structure of uncertainty disguised as routine. Jonathan Mercer would leave early, return late, and maintain conversations that remained strictly functional. Emily Mercer, despite her ongoing medical condition, continued to ask questions that reflected a child's attempt to understand a changing emotional environment. Her health updates remained medically stable in technical terms, yet emotionally, she became more sensitive to the absence of consistency within her home. Claire observed this shift with increasing clarity. It was no longer a matter of suspicion or interpretation. It was a matter of measurable emotional distance. One morning, Claire received a notification from the hospital confirming a scheduled adjustment in Emily's treatment plan. The message was routine, yet it arrived at a moment when Jonathan was already absent from the home. Claire read it alone at the kitchen table, her attention divided between clinical information and the growing realization that she was managing both emotional and practical responsibilities without shared participation. Later that day, Jonathan attended a private business luncheon that had no connection to his immediate family obligations. During the event, he remained composed and professional, engaging in discussions related to investment expansion and corporate restructuring. To those present, he appeared unchanged. However, During a brief pause between conversations, he checked his phone and noticed another message from Victoria Lane. This time, he did not respond immediately, but the presence of the message reflected a parallel thread in his life that continued to develop outside the boundaries of his household. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily to a follow-up medical consultation. The physician maintained a calm and professional tone, explaining that while the treatment plan was progressing within expected parameters, emotional stability within the home environment remained an important contributing factor. Claire listened carefully, acknowledging each detail without interruption. She understood the implication even if it was not stated directly. Emotional environment was no longer a background condition. It was a variable influencing outcomes that mattered deeply to her daughter's well-being. When they returned home, the atmosphere remained unchanged. Jonathan was not present. The house felt orderly but incomplete, as if essential elements of its original structure were slowly being removed without physical disruption. Emily rested in her room after the visit, and Claire remained in the living room for an extended period, observing the quiet space they inhabited. She reflected not on isolated incidents, but on continuity, the gradual reduction of shared presence, the increasing reliance on absence as default, the transformation of family life into parallel routines rather than shared experience. Across the city, Jonathan remained in his office later than usual, reviewing financial projections and strategic planning documents. Yet his focus drifted intermittently toward personal notifications he had not fully engaged with. The presence of Victoria Lane in his communication history remained subtle but persistent, influencing moments of hesitation that did not align with his usual decisiveness in professional matters. He did not openly acknowledge the internal division forming between his public identity and private choices, but its presence was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. At home, Claire finally stood and turned off the lights in the living room. The silence that followed was not new, but it felt more defined than before. It no longer represented peace or rest. It represented separation without declaration. In that quiet moment, she understood that the structure of their family was no longer simply changing. It was already changed, and the only remaining question was how long it would take for everyone involved to recognize it fully. The quiet fracture within the Mercer household continued to widen, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the accumulation of unresolved distance that neither Jonathan Mercer nor Claire Donovan openly addressed. By the following week, the pattern of separation had become fully established. Jonathan's presence in the home was increasingly irregular, while his communication remained limited to brief logistical exchanges. Claire, meanwhile, assumed nearly complete responsibility for Emily Mercer's daily care, managing medical appointments, emotional support, and household stability with minimal assistance. Emily's condition required consistent attention, but what concerned Claire more was the subtle emotional decline she observed in her daughter. Emily no longer asked about her father with the same curiosity as before. Instead, her questions became shorter, more hesitant, as if she was beginning to internalize absence as normality. One afternoon, Claire received an unexpected notification from the hospital regarding an administrative adjustment to Emily's treatment schedule. The change was minor in procedural terms, but it reinforced a reality Claire was becoming increasingly aware of. She was now the primary point of continuity in Emily's life, both emotionally and practically. That evening, Jonathan returned home later than usual, entering the residence with the same composed demeanor he maintained in professional environments. However, his attention remained partially divided, and his engagement with family matters was brief and procedural. During dinner, Emily attempted to share details from her day, but the conversation lacked the natural flow it once had. Jonathan responded appropriately, yet distantly, as though processing multiple layers of thought simultaneously. Claire observed this without interruption, noting not only what was said, but what was no longer present within the interaction. After dinner, Jonathan retreated to his study, where he reviewed documents unrelated to his household responsibilities. Among them were ongoing communications connected to Victoria Lane, whose presence in his external life had become increasingly consistent. While no explicit decisions were made within these exchanges, their frequency suggested a parallel structure of engagement that existed alongside, rather than within, his family obligations. Claire did not yet confront this directly, but her awareness of it had become undeniable. Later that night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Claire stood alone in the living room. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt neutral. It felt segmented, as if each room contained a different version of the same reality. She reflected on the gradual transformation that had taken place over time, recognizing that there had been no singular moment of rupture. Instead, there had been a sequence of small absences that collectively formed a larger emotional divide. Across the city, Jonathan remained in his private office longer than necessary, reviewing financial forecasts and strategic planning materials. However, his attention periodically shifted toward personal communications that he had not fully resolved. The duality of his focus had become increasingly routine, though not yet acknowledged as such. He continued to function effectively in his professional role, but the separation between his external performance and internal reality was becoming more pronounced. At home, Claire eventually turned off the remaining lights and prepared for rest. Before doing so, she paused briefly in the hallway outside Emily's room. Listening to her daughter's quiet breathing, she recognized the fragility of the stability she was trying to preserve. It was no longer simply about maintaining routine. It was about sustaining emotional continuity in an environment where continuity itself was gradually eroding. In that moment, without any confrontation or declaration, Claire understood that the structure of their family was no longer something that could be restored through waiting alone. What remained was a decision that had not yet been made, but could no longer be avoided indefinitely. The turning point within the Mercer family did not arrive with a single confrontation, but through a moment of quiet realization that Claire Donovan could no longer ignore. Over the following days, the pattern of Jonathan Mercer's absence became more defined, not only in physical presence, but in emotional availability. Emily Mercer's condition remained medically managed, but her emotional responses began reflecting the instability within her environment. She became quieter, more observant, and less inclined to initiate conversations about her father. Claire noticed this change with increasing clarity, recognizing that her daughter was adapting to absence rather than questioning it. One morning, Claire received a formal update from the hospital confirming another routine evaluation for Emily. The message was procedural, but it arrived at a time when Jonathan was once again not present at home. Claire read it without interruption, her attention lingering on the fact that her daughter's care had become a responsibility she was carrying almost entirely alone. Later that afternoon, Jonathan attended a private executive meeting in the city. The discussion centered around corporate expansion and financial restructuring, yet his attention intermittently drifted toward personal matters that remained unspoken within his professional environment. Among them were ongoing communications with Victoria Lane, whose presence in his external life had become increasingly consistent but deliberately compartmentalized. While no explicit actions were acknowledged, the continuity of those interactions suggested a parallel emotional trajectory that existed outside the structure of his family obligations. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily during a scheduled medical consultation. The physician maintained a calm and professional tone, outlining treatment progress while emphasizing the importance of emotional consistency within the home environment. Claire acknowledged the information without question, fully understanding its implications without needing further explanation. Stability, she realized, was no longer an abstract concept. It was directly influencing her daughter's well-being in measurable ways. When they returned home, Jonathan was not present. The house remained orderly, but the absence of shared presence created a sense of fragmentation that Claire could no longer dismiss as temporary. Emily went to rest early, and Claire remained in the kitchen for a long period, reviewing daily routines that had become increasingly one-sided. Each responsibility, each decision, each adjustment in their lives was now being managed primarily by her. Across the city, Jonathan extended his workday beyond necessity, remaining in his office while reviewing financial forecasts and strategic developments. Yet, even in this structured environment, his attention occasionally shifted toward personal communications that were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a recurring pattern. He did not formally acknowledge the duality forming in his life, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain complete separation between professional discipline and personal divergence. At home, Claire eventually moved through the quiet rooms of the house. turning off remaining lights and pausing briefly outside Emily's door. Listening to her daughter's steady breathing, she understood with growing certainty that the emotional structure of their family was no longer intact in the way it once had been. It had transitioned into something more fragile, sustained not by shared presence, but by her continued effort to maintain continuity alone. In that silence, Claire reached a realization that did not require confrontation to be true. The life she had been trying to preserve was no longer functioning as a unified structure. It was now a collection of separate paths moving within the same space, and the distance between them was no longer temporary. It was becoming permanent unless something fundamentally changed. The final breakdown within the Mercer family did not occur through a single dramatic confrontation, but through a slow and irreversible accumulation of emotional separation that Claire Donovan could no longer rationalize or delay acknowledging. Over the following days, Jonathan Mercer's absence from the household became increasingly structured rather than incidental. His presence was now predictable only in its inconsistency, arriving late in the evenings or not at all on certain nights without detailed explanation. Emily Mercer, still under ongoing medical observation, began to adjust her expectations accordingly. Her questions about her father diminished in frequency, replaced by quieter acceptance that no immediate response would follow. Claire observed this shift with growing concern, recognizing that her daughter was adapting not to stability, but to absence as a permanent condition. One morning, Claire received a routine update from the hospital confirming another scheduled assessment for Emily. The notification was procedural, yet it reinforced the reality that had been forming over time. Claire was now the primary constant in her daughter's daily life, responsible for both emotional continuity and practical care without shared participation from Jonathan. Later that day, Jonathan attended a private corporate engagement in Manhattan involving strategic investors and long-term capital planning discussions. His performance in the professional environment remained controlled and effective, consistent with his established reputation. However, his internal focus remained divided, periodically shifting toward unresolved personal communications that he had not fully addressed within his home life. Among these was his ongoing indirect connection with Victoria Lane, whose presence in his external interactions had become increasingly consistent, though carefully compartmentalized from his official responsibilities. No explicit decisions were acknowledged, but the persistence of this parallel engagement suggested an ongoing divergence between his professional identity and private trajectory. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily during a scheduled medical consultation at the hospital. The physician provided a structured update on treatment progress, maintaining a professional tone while emphasizing the importance of emotional consistency in the patient's home environment. Claire listened without interruption, fully understanding that the implications extended beyond medical parameters. Emotional stability was no longer a background factor. It had become a measurable influence on her daughter's recovery process. When they returned home, Jonathan was not present. The house remained orderly, yet the absence of shared occupancy created a sense of fragmentation that Claire could no longer interpret as temporary disruption. Emily retired early to her room, and Claire remained alone in the living space, observing the quiet structure of a home that functioned increasingly as separate individual routines rather than a unified family system. Across the city, Jonathan extended his working hours beyond necessity, remaining in his private office while reviewing financial projections and strategic expansion models. Although his attention remained primarily professional, intermittent focus shifts toward personal communications reflected an ongoing internal division that he had not formally acknowledged. The separation between his public role and private reality was no longer seamless, but he had not yet defined it as a problem requiring resolution. At home, Claire eventually moved through the dimly lit rooms, turning off remaining lights before pausing outside Emily's bedroom door. Listening to her daughter's steady breathing, she recognized with final clarity that the structure she had been maintaining was no longer supported by mutual participation. It existed now through her alone, sustained by repetition rather than shared intent. In that quiet moment, Claire understood that the life she had been trying to preserve had already transformed into something fundamentally different from what it once was. It was no longer a shared foundation, but a fragmented arrangement held together by endurance, and without decisive change, that fragmentation would continue to define everything that followed. The turning point within the Mercer family arrived not through confrontation, but through the quiet certainty that Claire Donovan could no longer delay what had already become inevitable. Over the days following her realization, she began to observe every detail of the household with a level of clarity that removed emotional interpretation and replaced it with structure. Jonathan Mercer's absence was no longer unpredictable. It had become patterned, almost scheduled in its inconsistency. He was present when required for appearance and absent when emotional engagement was expected. Emily Mercer, still under medical care, began to reflect this environment in subtle but significant ways. Her questions about her father diminished further, replaced by quiet acceptance that did not yet fully understand permanence, but was beginning to adjust to it. Claire noticed this shift not as a single moment of change, but as a gradual internalization of absence as normalcy. One morning, Claire received another standard update from the hospital regarding Emily's condition. The report remained medically stable, but it included a recommendation emphasizing emotional consistency within the home environment as a contributing factor to long-term recovery outcomes. Claire read the document carefully, not because the information was new, but because it confirmed what she had already begun to understand independently. Stability was no longer shared. It was maintained primarily through her alone. Later that day, Jonathan attended a private business meeting involving long-term financial structuring and partnership negotiations. His external performance remained unchanged, characterized by composure and efficiency. However, internally, his attention remained divided across multiple unresolved personal and professional channels. Among them was his ongoing indirect connection with Victoria Lane, whose presence in his communication network had become increasingly consistent, though carefully separated from his public identity. No explicit acknowledgement of conflict had yet been made, but the existence of parallel engagement patterns suggested a growing divergence between structured responsibility and private inclination. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily during a scheduled medical consultation. The physician maintained a professional tone while reviewing treatment progress, but placed emphasis on the importance of emotional continuity within the patient's immediate environment. Claire listened without interruption, fully aware that the implications extended beyond clinical observation. Emotional stability had transitioned from an abstract recommendation to a measurable factor influencing recovery trajectory. When they returned home, Jonathan was not present. The house remained orderly, but the absence of shared activity created an atmosphere that Claire now recognized as structural rather than temporary. Emily went to rest earlier than usual, and Claire remained alone in the living space, observing the quiet architecture of a household that no longer functioned as a unified system of interaction. Across the city, Jonathan extended his professional commitments into the late evening hours, remaining in his office while reviewing financial projections and strategic development models. Although his external focus remained disciplined, intermittent attention shifts toward personal communications reflected an internal division that he had not formally addressed. The separation between professional identity and private reality had become increasingly defined, though still unacknowledged as a structural imbalance. At home, Claire eventually moved through the dim interior of the residence, turning off remaining lights one by one before pausing outside Emily's room. Listening to her daughter's steady breathing, she understood with complete clarity that the emotional structure she had been preserving was no longer supported by mutual participation. It now existed through her alone, sustained by repetition rather than shared intent. In that silence, Claire recognized that the life she had been trying to maintain had already transformed into something fundamentally different from its original form, and without deliberate change, the distance between its parts would continue to expand until it became the defining condition of everything they were still calling a family. The final rupture within the Mercer household did not arrive as a single dramatic confrontation, but as the unavoidable consequence of accumulated distance that could no longer be rationalized or postponed. In the days following Claire Donovan's growing certainty, the structure of daily life inside the Mercer residence became increasingly defined by separation rather than connection. Jonathan Mercer's presence was now consistently fragmented, appearing only when required for external obligations or formal appearances, while remaining emotionally detached within the private space of the home. Emily Mercer, whose medical condition required ongoing care and emotional stability, began to adapt in ways that reflected her environment. Her once frequent questions about her father diminished into brief acknowledgments, replaced by a quiet acceptance that suggested she was beginning to normalize absence as part of her daily reality. Claire observed these changes with a level of clarity that no longer required interpretation. One morning, she received another clinical update from the hospital confirming that Emily's condition remained medically stable, but reinforcing once again the importance of emotional consistency within the home environment. The language of the report was professional and measured, yet its implication was direct. Recovery was no longer dependent solely on medical intervention, but on the stability of the environment in which the patient lived. Claire placed the document on the kitchen counter and stood still for a moment, understanding that she was now functioning as the primary source of continuity within the family structure. Later that day, Jonathan attended a private executive engagement involving strategic investors and long-term financial planning discussions. His performance in the professional environment remained controlled and effective, consistent with his established reputation. However, internally, his attention continued to divide between structured professional responsibilities and unresolved personal communications that he had not fully integrated into his public identity. Among these was his ongoing indirect connection with Victoria Lane, whose presence in his private communication channels had become increasingly consistent, though still compartmentalized from his official obligations. No explicit acknowledgement of conflict had been made, but the continued existence of parallel engagement patterns indicated a widening divergence between external discipline and internal fragmentation. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily during a scheduled medical consultation. The physician maintained a calm and professional tone while reviewing treatment progress, but emphasized once again that emotional stability within the immediate home environment remained a significant contributing factor to recovery outcomes. Claire listened without interruption, fully aware that the implication was no longer theoretical. Emotional continuity had become a measurable condition affecting her daughter's well-being. When they returned home, Jonathan was not present. The house remained orderly, but the absence of shared interaction created an atmosphere that Claire now recognized as structurally incomplete rather than temporarily quiet. Emily retired earlier than usual, and Claire remained alone in the living space, moving through the rooms with a sense of final observation rather than uncertainty. Across the city, Jonathan extended his work into the late evening, remaining in his office while reviewing financial projections and strategic models. His external focus remained intact, but intermittent attention shifts toward personal communications reflected an internal division that had not yet been formally addressed. The separation between his professional identity and private reality had become increasingly defined, though still unacknowledged as an unresolved structural imbalance. At home, Claire eventually turned off the remaining lights and paused outside Emily's room, listening to her daughter's steady breathing. In that moment, she understood with complete clarity that the emotional framework she had been maintaining was no longer supported by shared participation. It now existed entirely through her own effort, sustained by repetition rather than mutual intent. And in that realization, she recognized that what remained of their family was no longer a unified structure, but a collection of separated lives moving within the same physical space, held together only by routine, and steadily drifting beyond the possibility of natural restoration. The moment of truth within the Mercer household did not arrive through confrontation, but through the final realization that nothing within their shared life could continue unchanged. Over the days following Claire Donovan's growing clarity, the emotional structure of the family reached a point where absence had fully replaced participation. Jonathan Mercer's presence remained inconsistent, defined more by obligation than connection, while his emotional engagement with the household had effectively ceased. Emily Mercer, still under medical observation, no longer questioned her father's absence with the same emotional urgency. Instead, she had adapted to a quieter understanding, one shaped not by explanation but by repetition of experience. Claire observed this shift with a sense of final recognition. It was no longer a question of misunderstanding or temporary distance. It was the establishment of a new reality within the same physical space. One morning, Claire received another clinical update regarding Emily's condition. The report confirmed stability, but once again emphasized the importance of emotional continuity within the home environment. Claire read the message without reaction, placing the document aside as she understood that the recommendation had become something she alone was responsible for sustaining. That day, Jonathan attended another high-level business engagement in the city. His professional presence remained consistent, marked by control, discipline, and external composure. However, internally, the separation between his public identity and private life had become increasingly defined. His ongoing indirect connection to Victoria Lane remained present within his communication patterns, though still compartmentalized from his formal responsibilities. The parallel structure of his life continued without acknowledgement, existing alongside rather than within his declared priorities. That evening, Claire accompanied Emily during a final scheduled consultation for the week. The physician maintained a professional tone while reviewing treatment progress, reiterating once more that emotional stability within the home environment remained an essential factor in long-term recovery outcomes. Claire acknowledged the information silently, fully aware that the responsibility for that stability had already shifted entirely to her. When they returned home, Jonathan was not present. The house remained orderly, but the absence of shared presence had become a defining characteristic rather than an exception. Emily retired to her room without further discussion, and Claire remained in the living space alone, moving through each room with a quiet sense of observation. Across the city, Jonathan remained in his office beyond standard hours, reviewing financial models and strategic projections. His professional focus remained intact, yet intermittent attention shifts toward personal communications reflected an unresolved internal division that had not been formally addressed or reconciled. The separation between his structured external life and his fragmented private reality had become increasingly stable in its imbalance, no longer fluctuating but steadily fixed. At home, Claire eventually extinguished the remaining lights and paused outside Emily's room one final time. Listening to her daughter's steady breathing, she understood with absolute clarity that nothing within their family structure remained intact in the way it had once been. There was no longer a shared emotional foundation, only parallel existences occupying the same physical space. In that moment, Claire recognized that waiting had reached its limit. What remained was no longer uncertainty, but consequence. The life she had once tried to preserve had already completed its transformation into something else entirely, and the only direction left was forward, away from what could no longer be restored.